Hello and welcome to Roundtable. The latest challenge in the fight against COVID-19 is whether or not to vaccinate the under-18s. Do they need inoculating to slow the spread for all of us? Or do the risks to young people outweigh the benefits? Added to the health side of the question is one moral argument. Is it actually wrong to use vaccines on the young in richer countries when so many others worldwide can't even get a jab? I'm David Foster. Good to have your company. In some parts of the world, children as young as 12 are already being vaccinated. We will be looking at the dilemma facing health experts as they try to establish what is the best way forward. Across the world, millions of under-18s have already had the COVID-19 vaccine. Countries from the USA to France and New Zealand approving it. Some consider it a crucial move towards reaching herd immunity and getting life back to normal for all ages. Others are concerned that for young people, the danger of potential side effects is greater than the threat of COVID-19 itself. Teenagers generally develop much less severe forms of COVID than older people.
Offering a vaccine to children and young people aged 12 to 17 who...
A small but vocal group of anti-vaccination protesters were in London recently, calling for children to shun the jabs if they are offered them. The European Medicines Agency has already approved the use of Moderna and Pfizer's vaccines for children aged 12 and above. Regulators say both have been linked to extremely rare cases of chest pain and heart inflammation in young adults. Not all EU countries have started vaccinating children yet, citing the minimal risks that children face from coronavirus. So in the race against the surging Delta variant, the challenges of vaccine hesitancy and the return to schools. What is the right way to go? Let us welcome first to the programme from Canada, Anthony Skelton, Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Western Ontario. We welcome Dr. Alberto Giubilini, Senior Research Fellow on Collective Responsibility for Infectious Disease. He's at the University of Oxford and is in Oxford. And then we head to Bristol and see Gabriel Scally, Visiting Professor of Public Health at the University of Bristol. Welcome to each and every one of you to Roundtable. Looking from the top, we have a pro-vax children, an anti-vax children, and a pro-vax children, in that order, all with caveats, and we'll go into that to some extent later on. So, Anthony, let me come to you. You are in Canada. Canada's vaccinating children already. What's been the public reaction to that?
So far, the public reaction to vaccinating adolescents has been quite favorable. Many people are vaccinating their children. There's been a high rate of vaccination amongst them. Many children have had a first dose and are heading toward a second dose very soon, and so many children who are eligible to receive the vaccine will be vaccinated by the time school starts after Labor Day here in Canada.
And what is the reason for doing this?
There are a number of reasons why we might want to vaccinate adolescents. So first and foremost, it's to protect their own health. While children don't die at the same rate as adults, and especially vulnerable adults, they can die. But more importantly, they can be exposed through COVID infection to serious illnesses, multi-system failure, brain damage, organ damage, and other kinds of health effects. So that's one main reason. Another main reason is that having that population vaccinated helps achieve protection for the community as a whole. It also prevents the possibility of there being a population in which variants can develop that would then harm other members of the population, including those who are vulnerable because they can't be vaccinated for medical reasons or because their response to vaccines is less favorable than
I'm going to come back to you in a little while and ask you about a couple of statements you made about the fact that it's not too dangerous and the fact that you don't want children dying at the same rate as adults. Both of those have been challenged, and I'll come back to you for your response to that. But Alberto Giubilini, you don't believe that this is the right strategy to follow, partly because you think the vaccinations should go to countries where people cannot afford it, and you're wasting them on the young, if you like. What other reservations do you have?
One reason is that vaccines would be better used in other countries at this moment, but it's just one reason. So I think we should not vaccinate children at this stage, regardless of the availability of vaccines for the other countries. And the reason is simply that it's not very clear at the moment that vaccines are in the best interest of children and adolescents, because it's very, very rare for children to be hospitalized with COVID-19. And there are some risk for children, as Anthony was saying, but the risk is incredibly small. So we're talking about 3% of cases with serious with neurological complications among the children hospitalized, which are a very, very small minority. So there have been like 250 cases of children hospitalized in ICU in England in the last year. So this is a very small number. And of these cases, 2/3 of them are resolved without complication within a few weeks. So the benefit of the vaccine to children is very unclear at the moment. Vaccines do carry some risks, very minor, but there is a lot of uncertainty about the risks of vaccines for children at the moment because we haven't had many data about it yet. And also, it would make sense to vaccinate children despite some small risk of the vaccine, even if it's not in the children's best interest, if there was a significant public health benefit to it.
Well, can I just throw this one at you? You say it's not necessarily in the children's best interest. We don't know one way or the other for certain. But the argument, the other argument, is that it is in the rest of the population's best interest because it increases the level of immunity among the population as a whole. And if that happens, surely that's a good thing.
If that happened, that's a good thing. And if that was the case, if vaccines were sufficiently effective at reducing transmission, that would be a strong reason for vaccinating children as well. It's very unclear that that's the case at the moment, actually, because these vaccines are extremely effective at preventing serious cases in adult people. They're not as effective at preventing transmission. So the collective benefit of vaccinating children is very uncertain. If there were a clear benefit for children, I will be in favor, but it's very unclear there is a benefit to children, and the collective benefit of it is very uncertain at the moment. So overall, if you do a risk-benefit analysis at the moment, I think we should not vaccinate children because we don't know what level of risk we're imposing on children. And this comes after a period, more than 1.5 years, in which children and young people have already been unfairly burdened by all sorts of restrictions to protect the elderly, not to protect themselves. So all these lockdowns, children didn't benefit at all.
Okay, well, I will come back to you and ask you more about this idea of giving the vaccinations to those people in developing countries where it cannot be afforded at the moment. But thank you for now. Gabriel Scally, let me come to you and ask you about the situation in the Republic of Ireland with regard to vaccinating children. What's happening there?
Well, the Republic of Ireland has decided to go ahead with the vaccination of children, of young people, actually, not children, young people 12 and over. The Republic of Ireland has done extremely well in terms of catching up in vaccination. The UK had stormed ahead early on, but the Republic has caught up and now they want to move even faster. And they're doing that for very good reasons. The very good safety profile of the vaccines. The vaccines have been approved by the regulators, by the safety regulators. And I think it's something like 10 million young people have been vaccinated in the United States, and the safety profile is very good. There is one minor side effect with young boys, but in fact that occurs 6 times more common in young boys who've been infected with the disease than it does with the vaccine. So the vaccine's a good vaccine. The second reason is because of the disruption in schools, and there is massive disruption in schools through outbreaks and trying to control outbreaks. How much better it would be if we didn't have that disruption, and it's better for the safety of the staff. But the big reason, and I think the big benefit, is the prevention of long COVID to a substantial extent. We know that about 10%, up to 10% of those young people, if they get infected, will have ongoing symptoms. And that's a huge number of young people, and that's disruption to their lives. And the final point, I think, is it all adds to the total body of immunity in the population, and that will, in due course, help us to keep the virus levels down and under control.
Anthony, I will come back to you in just a moment, but there's something I want to throw to Alberto because he's sceptical about this, and this is from Professor Devi Sridhar, chairman of Global Public Health, University of Edinburgh, earlier in July wrote, letting the virus spread among young people seems reckless. England is alone in doing this. It is acting as a laboratory for other countries which are watching to see what happens before they decide on their own policies towards children. The consequences could be a new variant that makes our current vaccines less effective or has more severe outcomes for unvaccinated children. Another argument for vaccinating children. It's not that they want to be treated like a laboratory. Somebody else said a petri dish.
It's not clear to me that children will be treated as a laboratory in the case of COVID, if you let them get COVID by natural infection, if that happens, as opposed to being vaccinated, because it's true that millions of children have been vaccinated, but we don't know the effects of the vaccine actually on children, because this happened very recently. We don't know anything about the long-term effects. So you remember when the AstraZeneca vaccine was approved for adults, so it took a lot of time actually to recognize that there was some problem with the blood clots, for example. It's a very, very rare side effect. I think that doesn't make the vaccine a bad thing. Actually, I think vaccine should be mandatory for adult people because it's in their best interest, collective best interest. But we can't really say now that these vaccines are not an experiment on children, because it's the same thing.
Gabriel, I would love to let you come back in because you're shaking your head in disagreement. You'll have your chance in just a moment. But Anthony, I want to go to you. Following up from those comments that we heard there from the Edinburgh University professor saying not giving children vaccines is basically making them an experiment in catching the disease, I want to know whether you believe in Canada that it's going to become compulsory in some cases. Dominic Raab, UK Foreign Secretary, not Health Secretary, of course, but Foreign Secretary, was asked, and he said, yes, they will be encouraging people to have it up to a certain age, but he wouldn't rule out the need for COVID passports for students, in other words, the under-18s, in university halls this year. It could be something that is compelled upon people. Is that right?
So in Canada, you may not know, healthcare is provincial or territorial responsibility. And so provinces would have to, and territories would have to make up their minds about whether or not they wanted to mandate vaccinations for the population in general. But some provinces, including the province in which I live in Ontario, we do have an Immunization of School Pupils Act, under which some vaccines are already mandatory for people if they wish to send their children to public school. And so, there would be nothing, apart from political will, for including the COVID-19 vaccine in the schedule of vaccines that are already mandatory. I think that the present moment, that's certainly a plausible option, especially for those people who are, wanting to send their children to public school and who are reluctant to vaccinate. Again, all children have a right to go to school and to be in environments where they're not exposed to serious risk. And so that's a strong reason to mandate, if it's not medically contraindicated, that people be vaccinated. I think the risk-benefit ratio is very favorable. As Dr. Scally said, lots of regulators have approved this, and we've seen, as he said, 10 million children in the U.S. and lots of children in other places vaccinated, and
but let me ask you this,
to be successful.
If I may, pardon me for interrupting.
Okay.
The argument about inoculating young people in certain developed countries, the richer countries, is that then the population as a whole is better protected. The argument that Alberto's putting forward about sending the vaccinations abroad is that if you don't immunize your own children, but send these to poorer countries, then global herd immunity, if it is at all possible, will be achieved much more quickly. So in vaccinating young people, is it not possible that we are looking after ourselves rather than looking after the best interests of the world?
Well, so there are sort of two things. One is, of course, the equity argument could have been raised at any point during the vaccine rollout. So, back in December or
But now it's even more pertinent, isn't it? Because the infection rates are dropping off. Large parts of the adult population are inoculated. Now we're just looking at the children as a sort of fail-safe backup, if you like.
Right. I mean, so if the concern is with development of variants that can happen in our young population as opposed to populations in the developing world, but the number of vaccines that would be used for inoculating young people is too small to meet the demand in developing nations. The real way to produce equitable outcomes is to investigate why there aren't more vaccines available, why very wealthy countries, including my own country, are bidding up the price of vaccines and buying vaccines for possible third doses for populations, and so on. And I think, what we've seen is governments have put up a lot of money to develop vaccines, and we want that public cost to be also realizing a public benefit, including for less developed nations to whom we have very strong obligations of equity, obligations that we had even when we were adults were taking vaccines. I could have waited 6 or 8 more months and said, our population should wait for other populations in developing nations. It seems strange to raise the issue only now on a population,
I've said
which, as Alberto
now,
said,
now that a large proportion of adult population have been inoculated and we're moving on to children, perhaps it is more pertinent than ever. Gabriel, I noticed that you were sitting there trying to make a point. You were very patient. Please make the point, and then I've got something else I want to ask you.
Well, there are 1 or 2 points that have come up, I think. Just to finish off on the vaccination thing, I mean, I understand the point of wanting to ship some of our vaccines to other countries, but that is irrational. The rational thing to do is remove the restriction on the intellectual property rights, give a patent waiver so that countries around the world can produce the vaccines that are needed. And I really think it's a very poor argument to produce at this stage an argument about shipping a limited amount of vaccines around the world, whereas what we really need are vaccines for the whole world. The second point is, these vaccines have been through a tremendous amount of scrutiny, albeit in a short time, and are subject to a very rigorous process of follow-up as well to find side effects, and that has worked very well in the past.
But pardon me, you have mentioned that before, so I want to go on to something else that you mentioned in your conversation with my producer, and that is, you said when you were asked about whether parents should encourage their children to have vaccines when the children are below a sort of reasonable decision-making age, and you likened it to seat belts.
Oh, well, the question has arisen that it should be left to the parents to decide. Well, we don't allow parents to make decisions if they endanger their children, like seatbelts. But we're talking in the case of the vaccines at the moment of those who are 12 years old and older. And many of those children make up their own minds about vaccination at the moment and can be vaccinated against their parents' will if they so wish. And after all, it is the young people who will be exposed. And one of my real concerns is we don't know the long-term effects of this dangerous virus on young people and on their brains, developing brains and growing brains. But
equally, we don't know the long-term effects, absolutely, of a vaccination on their brains.
Well, that is absolutely true, but we at least have a safety profile for the vaccines, and we know that there is no evidence of that, and we're in a position of doing something about it if any evidence emerges. But I'm long enough in the tool in practicing public health and putting into practice vaccination programs and learning about them to know that in the aftermath of the pandemic flu in the United States, there was a subsequent epidemic of cases of Parkinson's disease. And we do know that this COVID-19 virus does affect brains very substantially, creates damage to brains, creates brain fog as part of the long COVID complex of symptoms. It's an extraordinarily dangerous virus and an extremely safe vaccine. For me, it is absolutely a clear choice. We have to protect our young people.
Okay, Alberto, let me come to you. And as I do so, I'm going to read out a few of the countries that are making vaccinations available for those over the age of 12 up to the age of 18. Denmark, France, Germany, those are a number of European countries. Then you move to non-EU, Switzerland and Norway, Middle East, Israel. And I'll ask you this question. Vaccinating children, you say, would be a way of treating them as a mere means to serve other people's interests. Before you answer that, we get to the Asia-Pacific, New Zealand, then the Americas, Brazil, United States and Canada. We've already spoken to Alberto. What do you mean by serving other people's interests?
So I mean the fact that you do something, in this case children do something that does not benefit them, and I stress this, does not benefit them. And I know that the two speakers before me have said the opposite, but I don't see the numbers for that. So assuming that's true, that it doesn't benefit them, the only reason for doing that is to protect other people, say the vulnerable, or to protect the healthcare system in case the vaccine stops transmission. So in this case, you treat children as means, as mere instruments. This is not necessarily wrong. I think sometimes that's the right thing to do. If the risk you pose on children is very small, if there is some benefit for children, and if the public good you bring about is very big. I actually wrote papers arguing that we should sometimes vaccinate children to protect the elderly, for example, in the case of the flu vaccine. It doesn't seem to me that this is the case at the moment, because the risk of COVID for children is really small. This thing about long COVID is very, very unclear at the moment. There are studies that have completely different numbers.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you there. Why is it okay to get a flu jab if you're a child, but not this jab?
Because we know the safety profile of the flu vaccine. So we know about that. We have way more data about the safety profile of the flu vaccine, which is not completely without risk. No vaccine is without risk, but it's safe enough. And the public good that it can bring about is very big.
I'll come back to Anthony, and I will ask him to try and convince you otherwise.
You know, we have an empirical dispute, right, about the safety profile of the vaccine. I agree with the other speaker that it's been approved by regulators, and they've given it a good hard look. And we've been vaccinating millions of children, and what side effects we've seen emerge have been handled fairly well and effectively. So I think it's in many ways a no-brainer. It's very safe, and yes, we don't know the long-term effects, but we also know that there are serious side effects of COVID-19 infection, and we don't know the long-term effects of letting the population of young people be infected. It seems like that's equally to expose them to a risk, which we know we have a tool which is safe and effective to prevent. Right? I mean, it seems to me just a clear-cut case of it being right to do this to protect these young children.
It's okay to use a risk-benefit analysis when it comes to children, to say, look, some of you may get severe side effects, you may get heart inflammation, you may end up with other difficulties as well, because there have been a number of documented serious cases. But you say that's okay in terms of risk-benefit, is it?
Well, so of course, as Alberto said, no vaccine is without risk. But the issue is never whether we should experience risk. It's whether the risk-benefit profile is favorable. So the risks are very low and the benefit is very high. So that seems to me to be a good reason to inoculate the children who are eligible to receive the vaccine.
Gabriel, back to you, because you've got a point to make. And Alberto, I won't leave you out because I know you want to help wrap all of this up, and you are slightly on your own. But Gabriel, you first.
The risk of the pericarditis amongst young people who've been vaccinated is 1/6 of the risk of pericarditis to them if they catch COVID. 1/6. And we do give vaccines to young people that they don't need, that are no benefit to them, such as the rubella vaccine. And we do that not to protect other people, but it's actually to protect children that may be born in utero. And Alberto mentioned the influenza vaccine, and one of the big reasons for vaccinating young children is so that they won't pass the flu on to their grandparents and protect them. And that's what vaccines is all about, really. It is about the collective good of us all. Of course, we have to make them safe and we have to protect people, but they are a collective benefit. The ideal and selfish way, of course, is that everyone else gets vaccinated and you don't.
OK, Alberto, whatever point you want to make, do make it. But I noticed earlier on you said the population as a whole, if you had your way, would generally have to be inoculated. Do you think the same will happen with young people? They'll be forced to have it?
Well, I think it's happening. So some countries are doing it. I don't think it's the right thing to do. But I see this happening because I think people largely overestimate the risk of COVID for children and are underestimating the potential risk of vaccine. The simple reason why they're underestimating is that we really don't know anything about the long-term effects of the vaccine. Since the risk for adult people of COVID is great, it makes sense to take the risk for adult people. Maybe if we talk about this next year and we have more data about the safety profile of this vaccine on children, maybe I will change my mind on that. Simply at the moment, I don't have the data to support that kind of claims.
A final quick point. What will you think of a world that forces children to have this?
I think it's a world that, as it has been done during this pandemic, is acting very irrationally. Like many of the restrictions we had during this pandemic has been completely irrational and disproportionate, especially on children, unfairly burdening children. And this will be another step in the same direction of unfairly burdening children to protect other people's interests, that is, using their mere means.
Alberto, there you are, rather stuck in the middle, fighting your corner very well indeed. Thank you very much indeed, Anthony, Alberto, and to you, Gabriel. Thank you for coming on the programme. Thank you, wherever you happen to be watching this edition of Roundtable, for sparing the time to join us. We hope you'll do so on another occasion, but for now, that is it. Until next time, goodbye.